Sometimes you think your neighborhood is quiet, peaceful, normal, and then something happens that makes you question every assumption you've ever had about personal space. For me, it was a balcony, or rather, a balcony that didn't belong there. I came home one afternoon, carrying groceries, looking forward to unloading, maybe having a cup of coffee, and there it was, a balcony. A massive, awkwardly looming balcony right over my backyard, casting a shadow across my garden, my patio, even part of the swing set where my kids played. I froze for a moment, just staring, trying to process it. My first thought was, this can't be real. This isn't legal. Someone's joking, right? And then I noticed the details. The supports, the railings, the way it overhung my property by a good 3 feet, enough to make a difference. My backyard, which used to get the afternoon sun, now had a balcony looming over it, changing everything. I could already imagine the summer heat being blocked, the shade messing with the plants I'd spent years nurturing, and worse, losing the sense of privacy that makes a backyard feel like your own little sanctuary. And I knew, instantly, that the guy next door, let's call him Mr. Jenkins, had done this deliberately. At first, I thought about confronting him immediately, storming over, arms crossed, voice raised, demanding answers. But I've learned over the years that that rarely works, and it rarely gets you satisfaction. So instead, I went inside, dumped the groceries on the counter, and started pacing. I pulled out the old property survey, the deeds, the documents I had carefully filed over the years. Sure enough, the line was clear. That balcony was 3 feet onto my property. That wasn't just a mistake. That was arrogance, plain and simple. I spent the next hour staring out the window, watching Mr. Jenkins from across the fence. He was casually painting the balcony railing, humming a tune, completely unaware, or pretending to be, that he had invaded my space. And I could feel the mix of frustration and irritation building inside me. Not the blind rage that makes people act stupid, but the slow, simmering kind that fuels careful planning. I realized right then that if I wanted this corrected, I couldn't just yell or complain. I had to make sure the situation resolved itself in a way that was undeniable, unavoidable, and, frankly, satisfying. That's when I started thinking creatively. I wasn't going to break anything. I wasn't going to get into an argument that escalated to the HOA or lawyers. Well, maybe eventually, but not as my first move. I needed leverage. I needed evidence. And I needed patience. So I began taking pictures. Detailed pictures. Angles from every part of my backyard. Shadows showing how much of my property was blocked. Close-ups of the balcony supports that clearly crossed the boundary line. I documented everything meticulously, like an investigator building a case. Next, I did a little reconnaissance. Not sneaky, not invasive, just careful observation. I measured the overhang with a tape measure, compared it to the property line, noted the way it interfered with sunlight and airflow. I even checked the local building codes, zoning laws, and any permits. Spoiler alert, he had none of the proper paperwork. Nothing. It was a blatant violation. And I could feel a grin forming on my face because once the evidence was in hand, the path forward was clear. I wasn't just angry. I was strategic, and strategy is always more satisfying than yelling. I even consulted a couple of neighbors quietly, just casual conversation. Hey, have you noticed that balcony? I asked, and their reactions ranged from surprise to outrage, which only reinforced my sense that this wasn't just my personal battle. It was a small, community-scale injustice. And with that, I started formulating the plan. Step 1, gather evidence. Step 2, prepare legal and procedural leverage. Step 3, ensure that Mr. Jenkins would have no choice but to correct his mistake. While all this was going on, I had to manage my own frustration. Every glance outside, every time I saw that balcony looming over my garden, my mind raced with what-if scenarios. What if he refused to comply? What if he got defensive? What if I had to escalate to the city or HOA? And each of these thoughts fueled the next part of my plan, making it foolproof. I wasn't just reacting, I was anticipating. And in that anticipation, I found a strange satisfaction, a thrill that only comes from knowing you're about to turn the tables in a situation that seemed hopeless at first glance. The following days were a mix of careful measurement, note-taking, and subtle observation. I didn't approach him yet. I didn't send emails. I simply documented, calculated, and imagined the moment when all the evidence would be undeniable. The balcony wasn't going anywhere on its own, and Mr. Jenkins certainly wasn't going to realize his mistake by himself. But I knew that once the proof was undeniable, once the legal framework and the neighborhood awareness aligned, he would have no choice. And that anticipation, that slow build-up, was half the satisfaction. Then came the first interaction. I approached him calmly, no shouting, just friendly but firm. "Hey, I think your balcony is crossing onto my property," I said. He laughed lightly, brushing it off. "It's just a few inches. Does it really matter?" he said. That was the moment I realized words alone weren't enough. Evidence would speak louder than my voice. I politely mentioned that I had checked the property line and taken measurements. That was enough to make him pause for a second, the tiniest crack in his confidence. And I knew then that the next step, involving the city inspector or zoning office, would be decisive. And so, by the end of that week, I had everything ready: photos, measurements, building codes, and a plan to escalate if necessary. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing it out of principle, fairness, and the basic respect of property boundaries. But I also had to admit, I was excited. Not about conflict, but about seeing a situation that initially seemed hopeless resolved cleverly, without confrontation, and with a sense of justice firmly in place. The next few days were a mix of anticipation, calculation, and constant observation. I kept glancing out the window, checking the angles of the balcony, imagining every possible interaction that could go wrong or right. Mr. Jenkins was still humming along, painting his railings, moving furniture up there as if nothing mattered, completely oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in my mind. And honestly, part of me had to laugh. There he was, enjoying his balcony like it was a triumph, and I was plotting a slow, meticulous correction that would make sure justice was delivered, without me ever raising my voice. I began by strengthening my evidence. I measured every overhang, noted every shadow it cast on my garden, and documented how it interfered with the sunlight hitting my plants. I took pictures at different times of day, so anyone who looked at them would see undeniable proof that this balcony was trespassing onto my property. And I even recorded a short video, walking along the line of my backyard, pointing to where the supports crossed into my space. By the time I was done, I had a file that would make any inspector or HOA officer stop and say, "Yep, that's clearly your property." Next came the planning phase for escalation. I called the city zoning office, not to complain yet, just to clarify building codes, setback requirements, and the process for submitting a complaint. I wanted to understand exactly what steps would be required so that when the time came, the outcome would be in my favor. I also spoke to a friend who had experience in construction and property law, just hypothetically, to make sure I wasn't overlooking anything. Every detail mattered. Every tiny misstep could allow Mr. Jenkins to wiggle out of compliance. Meanwhile, Mr. Jenkins continued his weekend routine. He hosted a small barbecue one afternoon, standing on the balcony, gesturing to his guests, completely unaware that his actions were being quietly monitored. And every time he leaned over, I could see the slight intrusion into my airspace, the exact way the balcony extended over my yard, affecting not just sunlight but the sense of privacy I had always cherished. My kids noticed too. "Dad, it's like a shadow palace," my youngest said, eyes wide. I laughed, but inside, I felt a mix of amusement and determination. This wasn't just about me. It was about boundaries, respect, and making sure that someone who took liberties with another person's property faced consequences. The real action began when I sent the first formal notice. I included my measurements, photos, and a politely worded letter. "Dear Mr. Jenkins, it appears your balcony extends onto my property by approximately 3 feet. Please adjust accordingly or contact the proper authorities to resolve this matter." I didn't expect him to respond reasonably. He never did. But the act of documenting everything was part of the strategy. Evidence, combined with process, is harder to ignore than anger. And sure enough, his response was predictably defensive. "It's a minor thing," he wrote back. "No one even notices." I read it, sighed, and knew the next step was inevitable. I scheduled a city inspector visit. The day of the inspection, I was up early, pacing my backyard, camera ready, kids peeking curiously, and my cat perched on the fence like she was my loyal assistant. The inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, asking questions, measuring, checking permits. I stayed calm, letting the evidence speak for itself. Mr. Jenkins came outside, curious, brushing off his suit, looking slightly smug, thinking perhaps this would be a routine visit. He was about to learn the hard way that evidence and law aren't so easily brushed aside. The inspector moved meticulously, measuring from every corner, checking support beams, reviewing property lines. I watched as Mr. Jenkins' confidence began to falter. His smirk faded, replaced by the kind of nervous twitch that happens when someone realizes they've crossed a line they didn't anticipate. So, this is technically on your property, the inspector said to him, pointing to the overhang. And for the first time, Mr. Jenkins paused, shifting from foot to foot, muttering something about how the line might not be exact. That was my moment. I kept my tone neutral, letting the facts speak. I measured multiple times, I said. Surveyor's lines confirm it. And this has been documented for months. The inspector nodded, double-checked, and finally turned to Mr. Jenkins with a formal statement. You will need to remove or adjust this balcony so that it no longer encroaches on your neighbor's property. The words hung in the air like a sentence delivered in slow motion, and I could feel the tension, the satisfaction, the culmination of all the preparation and patience. Mr. Jenkins reacted predictably. He argued, of course, citing minor inconvenience and negligible impact. But the inspector was firm, precise, and legally grounded. He had no choice. And that's when I felt that deep, quiet satisfaction, the kind you only get when the system itself aligns with fairness, and no confrontation, no shouting, no drama beyond the necessary formalities is required. Over the next few days, the dismantling began. Crews arrived, tools clanking, boards coming down, supports removed. I watched from my backyard, coffee in hand, kids excitedly narrating the process as if it were a spectacle. Look, Dad, it's falling, one of them shouted, eyes wide. I laughed quietly, thinking about how all the patience, preparation, and documentation had turned what could have been a headache into a clear, decisive outcome. There were moments of petty tension, Mr. Jenkins muttering, trying to justify his actions, neighbors watching. Curiously, but none of it mattered. By the end of the week, the balcony that had loomed over my backyard was gone. Sunlight returned, the swing set was no longer shaded, and the sense of privacy I had lost was fully restored. And as I leaned back, sipping my coffee, I realized something important. The real victory wasn't in removing the balcony. It was in how I handled it. Strategically, patiently, legally, and creatively. I had learned a few things along the way. First, patience is more effective than immediate confrontation. Second, preparation and documentation are your best allies when dealing with someone who thinks rules don't apply to them. And third, sometimes the most satisfying resolutions are those that let the system itself deliver justice without escalating conflict. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't threatened, I hadn't become the angry neighbor. I had planned, observed, and acted, and the result was undeniable. By the end of that week, Mr. Jenkins had no choice but to comply. The backyard was restored, the boundary respected, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. My kids could play again, my plants could thrive, and the shadow that had loomed over our lives was gone. And that, I realized, is the kind of satisfaction that comes from doing things the right way, cleverly, ethically, and effectively. By the weekend, the balcony dismantling was complete. The boards had been removed, the supports were gone, and my backyard finally felt like my own again. I walked outside, stretching, taking in the sunlight that had been blocked for weeks. It was one of those rare moments where you can actually breathe and feel satisfied, not just because something you wanted was restored, but because of how it happened, the patience, the planning, the clever, legal way it all unfolded. And as I looked around, I realized that this story wasn't just about a balcony. It was about boundaries, respect, and the power of strategy over confrontation. Mr. Jenkins, of course, wasn't happy. I saw him muttering under his breath, pacing the sidewalk as crews finished up the last screws. His friends waved awkwardly, clearly aware that something significant had happened, and he had no choice but to accept it. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge wrongdoing. But the look in his eyes said it all, the realization that arrogance has limits, and that sometimes even the most stubborn people can be forced to confront the consequences of their actions without anyone raising their voice. My kids were thrilled. They ran around the yard, jumping and laughing, pointing to the places where the balcony had once overshadowed their play area. "Dad, we can swing again," my youngest exclaimed. And I smiled, thinking about how much of this wasn't just about property, but about teaching them a lesson too. That fairness, patience, and clever problem-solving often get results far more lasting than shouting or retaliation ever could. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes. Mr. Jenkins started behaving more cautiously, double-checking permits, asking neighbors before starting any new project. He wasn't openly friendly. He wasn't going to be, but the dynamic had shifted. He had learned something important. There's a line, and crossing it has consequences. And while some might say I was too harsh, too meticulous, I would argue that I was fair. The boundary had been clear, the violation undeniable, and the resolution handled thoughtfully. Neighbors, of course, noticed too. Mrs. Patel waved at me from across the street, a knowing smile on her face. "Looks like someone finally learned the rules," she said quietly. I nodded, feeling that sense of community validation that comes when justice is delivered cleverly, subtly, and without drama. It was one of those rare situations where everyone learned a lesson. The kids, the neighbors, the HOA, and yes, even Mr. Jenkins. I realized that the real victory wasn't just the removal of the balcony. It was the process itself, the careful observation, the documentation, the legal preparation, and the strategy that allowed me to maintain my composure while achieving a clear result. I had navigated frustration, planned meticulously, and executed without anger, and the satisfaction was profound. It's a reminder that patience and intelligence often outperform aggression and impulsivity. That said, the story isn't entirely over. Mr. Jenkins still eyes the space occasionally, probably wondering if there's some loophole or clever trick that will allow him to assert control. And I watch with mild amusement, knowing that the lesson is now permanent, internalized through experience rather than confrontation. That subtle tension, that quiet acknowledgement of boundaries, is exactly the result I had hoped for all along. So here's the takeaway for anyone watching. Sometimes conflicts seem trivial, property lines, minor encroachments, even a balcony overhang, but they reveal human behavior, arrogance, and respect in ways that are easy to overlook. The way you respond to such situations matters. You can escalate, argue, or shout, or you can be strategic, patient, and clever. I chose the latter, and it worked. The result was lasting, fair, and, most importantly, effective. Now it's your turn. What would you do if a neighbor built something over your property without permission? Would you call the HOA immediately, hire a lawyer, or find a clever, strategic way to make sure your rights were respected? Drop your stories in the comments. Share your opinions on right and wrong. And let's discuss how boundaries, respect, and clever problem-solving play out in everyday life. Who's fair? Who's over the line? And is strategy more satisfying than confrontation? I want to hear it. Remember, the best victories are often quiet. They don't need shouting, confrontation, or drama. They come from preparation, patience, and clever action. They're the kind of victories that teach lessons subtly but permanently, that shift behavior without causing unnecessary harm, and that leave everyone involved understanding the consequences of crossing lines. And as I sit on my porch, sipping coffee in my warm backyard, watching sunlight fall where the balcony once blocked it, I know this lesson will last much longer than the boards that once shadowed my garden. Sometimes, the smallest conflicts reveal the most about human behavior, pride, and respect. And the way you handle them can define not just the outcome, but your own sense of satisfaction, fairness, and intelligence. In this case, patience, cleverness, and documentation won the day, proving that even the most arrogant neighbor can be reminded of boundaries without ever raising your voice.